12.5 minutes after takeoff, about 8:31 p.m., as the 747 approached 14,000 feet, something happened. It's still not clear what.
First time that there has been a terrible air disaster off the coast of Long Island in New York. TWA Flight 800 has, by all accounts, exploded in the air and crashed into the sea.
TWA800 was down there in the dark, on fire and in pieces. There had been an explosion, and the jumbo jet went down in the Atlantic about 10 miles off Long Island's south shore.
I have 984, please. It was 945.
People put out to sea in fishing and pleasure boats to look for survivors.
An FAA source has told ABC News late this evening that there was no distress call from TWA's Flight 800. Under those circumstances,
family members and friends went to the airports in New York and Paris, not sure what else to do, and hoping for some kind of miraculous salvation for TWA Flight 800. By daybreak, the news was only worse. Everyone, the whole manifest of 230 passengers and crew, was dead. The parts of the plane were large and small, completely anonymous and intensely personal.
You pick up everything that indicates, you know, from clothing to things that people carry with them in their luggage or things like that, and it takes its toll after a while.
As soon as it was clear no one had lived through the explosion, the hunt for survivors became the hunt for answers.
We have no evidence at this point that this was not an accident. So the NTSB, as long as this is considered an accident, will be in charge of the investigation.
The National Transportation Safety Board flew up a GO team from Washington to investigate an accident. The FBI came over from New York City to start work on a crime, perhaps the biggest in U.S. history.
If it is a terrorist event, we then have the challenge to find out who the perpetrators were, who the cowards were that did this, as we do in all these other investigations.
The task ahead was daunting. Flight 800 was somewhere 10 miles off the coast of Long Island, its precise location unknown, and under 120 feet of water. But for a 747 to blow up and disintegrate in 35 seconds runs counter to most experience.
The 747 is an extremely airworthy and safe airplane. It's been around for 25 years or more, and over that time, Boeing and all the airlines that operate it have been able to identify and correct specific problem areas on the plane and refine its design and systems so that they get more and more confident that once it's up in the air, it's going to stay there.
So what had gone wrong? In the first days, very few pieces of the plane were available and only a few bodies. Evidence was still scarce and slow coming in. Attention was turned on the 747 itself. Its safety record is above the industry average, but the 747 is not indestructible. Of the nearly 1,100 built, 24 had expired from unnatural causes. Jumbo jets were blown up on Middle East runways in 70 and 73, making them a trophy for terrorists and setting off an era of attacks on jetliners. 747s collided on a runway in the Canary Islands in 77, killing 579 people. A missile blew up a Korean 747 off the Soviet Union in 1983. Bombs were blamed for the crash of Pan Am 103 at Lockerbie, Scotland, and an Air India 747 that went into the Irish Sea. And 9 died when the cargo door came off a United 747 after takeoff from Honolulu. Perhaps the most intriguing of all, in terms of Flight 800, was the explosion of an Iranian Air Force 747 while trying to land at Madrid Airport in 1976. No cause was ever determined, but it was suspected that lightning had ignited a fuel tank. That plane and N93119, the 747 that became Flight 800, had both been sold to Iran by TWA. The Flight 800 jet was bought back a year later and turned in 20 years of reliable service.
This aircraft was in very good shape, and one investigator described it to me as an airplane that had been taken care of very well. Very few repeated maintenance problems written up on the airplane. The aircraft had had all of the maintenance that the FAA and Boeing had said was necessary to keep it safe. And as you've heard, some of the pilots also report that it was a fine machine to fly.
It had just had its 25th birthday, 2 days before the crash. It was the 153rd 747 to come off the assembly line, and at 93,000 hours and more than 16,000 flights, it had reached about 80% of its life expectancy. It was headed for retirement around the turn of the century. Like most 747s, it averaged 700 flights a year.
I just have looked at this morning the record of the repairs in that airplane. And there had been numerous cracks in the frames and numerous cracks in stringers, but not an unusual number for that old an airplane.
Pilots shut down engines 13 times and made 25 unscheduled landings, but engines only quit twice on their own. Not unusual numbers for 2 decades of service. The aircraft earned its living flying across the Atlantic and around Europe. It had come in from Athens that day and had just turned around for Paris with its 230 passengers and crew members. There was no reason to think that Flight 800's wounds were self-inflicted. TWA has a good safety record and hadn't lost passengers in 22 years.
This is a half-mile block here.
The degree of difficulty of the investigation was exceeded only by the sense of urgency. Whatever had caused the crash or whoever was responsible was still out there. Presumably, it could happen again. The FBI's Jim Kallstrom made his reputation eavesdropping on the John Gotti mob. Now he was building up a force of 500 agents to help him find out who or what killed Flight 800.
There was an explosion on the aircraft. That was my opinion. And that would be caused by, could be caused by a bomb. It could be caused by, as a lot of the media is speculating, a rocket, I suppose. Or it could be caused by mechanical reasons. And that's really what the two of us have been trying to find out here, and really what we're trying to do here today. So,
the U.S. Navy was on the scene, ready to do the heavy lifting. The Coast Guard was directing traffic on the water. Half a dozen police forces were doing the legwork on land. Numerous government agencies had pitched in, along with doctors, dentists, and X-ray specialists to help identify the victims. And all ears were turned to the ocean, listening for the same thing: acoustic beacons calling out the location of the black boxes with ultrasonic clicks. The black boxes, the flight data recorder, and the cockpit voice recorder are usually the first things mentioned after what, where, and how many dead in reports of an air crash. The boxes, which are in fact orange, are cracked open and analyzed at the NTSB labs in Washington, where they can make a lot out of not very much.
Basically, a guy like this sits in the cockpit. Sole purpose in life is to pick up ambient noises in the cockpit, whether it be buzzes and whistles or engine noises or prop noises or any sort of thing. That's what this job is for.
Across the floor at the NTSB is where the flight data recorders come to roost and tell their sad stories. The information is all digital, and it concerns things like direction of the plane, speed, altitude, position of control surfaces, on up to a total of 700 parameters on the newest Boeing jets.
You're just moving the tape past the heads, and the heads are actually extracting the information, and then we put it into a computer program. But generally, this is how it looks. It's the same size. They're all the same size. They're all the orange color. This is the underwater locator beacon here, which is when they talk about when a recorder is immersed in water, you talk about the pinger and all that. That's what this is.
Yeah, here's a PLS 30, what we call it, pinger locator, system 30, 30,000 feet capable. It's gonna listen for the pinger coming from the flight recorder all the way around in a complete circle around this unit as we tow it in the water. This is going to get us in the ballpark where that pinger might be.
With the wreckage still not located and speculation about the possible cause nothing more than a guess, the flight data recorders, the black boxes, were one-stop shopping for what everyone needed. Find the boxes, find the plane, open the boxes, hear what the plane had to say for itself. Case closed, or at least a lot further along the road to resolution. After a week, Flight 800 existed somewhere between a memory and a promise, but for the moment it was lost at sea.
The search box is 46 miles by 65 nautical miles. That area is twice the size of the state of Rhode Island. And we've searched that area, that box, over 40 times so far.
There were hopes the flight data recorders would deliver a quick solution to the crash, but they were still out there with the rest of the plane, getting scrubbed and corroded by the salt water and the tides. By the Sunday after the crash, pressure was building to recover bodies and nail down a cause or a culprit. But they still hadn't found where Flight 800 had actually come to rest.
We really didn't have a clear understanding of where the wreck went exactly in the water. Later on that day, the NTSB had given us the last transponder hits that they had from air traffic control in New York at Kennedy. Knowing that it was going 340 knots and it was at 13,500 feet, figuring out a parabolic equation, we figured it out where it went in.
The crew of the Rudy deployed a side-scan sonar unit to chart the ocean floor with sound waves.
It's going through the water and it's shooting out sonar rays off to an angle, about a 20-degree depression. Anything that would be man-made down there would show up as square edges or tight corners.
The Rudy normally did underwater mapping in support of commercial shipping. Once it locked into the satellite signals and land beacons of the global positioning system, it could pinpoint the location of Flight 800. The electronic gear went to work underwater and slowly sent images up to the ship.
You can see we got a piece of it on the CBAT, and there it is on the side scan. That, I think, was determined to be the forward landing gear. And then this was the forward portion of the aircraft. All these contacts here were portions of the aircraft on the seafloor. Yeah, this is the main cabin section with the cabin and the first class section, et cetera, et cetera. This is what it looked like when we first found it.
Even with all the investigators in overall agreement about the need to solve the crash and remove the threat of a repeat, there was still the question: were they there to explain an accident or solve a crime?
The first concern is to preserve the scene, and we'd photograph first. The other concerns would be to bring up wreckage and, of course, to bring back the victims.
Everyone wanted to get the answers. It was the questions they weren't sure of.
Well, you have a clash of investigative styles. The NTSB is in the business of building a consensus among all the experts out in the industry who happen to work for the aircraft manufacturers or the airlines or the pilots unions or the mechanics unions. These are the people who know the equipment and the operations inside and out, but they also have an inherent conflict in that they're interested in the welfare of their own outfit, not necessarily the outcome of the investigation. The FBI, on the other hand, has a typical law enforcement philosophy of we're the investigators and you're all suspects.
We're looking at everything that touched this aircraft, everyone that went on board, came off, left Athens, came to Kennedy, boarded to go to Paris, maintenance people, everybody.
But whatever the urgency and importance, conditions did not favor the investigators. The water was cold, choppy, and dark, the wreckage sharp and dangerous. They needed to get a better look at the situation.
This is what's known as a laser line scan system. Basically, it's a laser device that makes a swath on the seafloor, a large panoramic image of seafloor conditions. It sends down a narrow beam of laser light. In this case, it's a blue-green light. And the amount of energy intensity that's reflected back is what's recorded. And as the towfish is pulled through the seafloor, these swath lines are added up until you eventually have what looks like a video image.
Science applications up at Newport, Rhode Island, could shine some light on Flight 800, even 120 feet below the surface.
The laser resolution that we've been able to determine over the years of using the system is on the order of, maybe half a centimeter, maybe a quarter of an inch. We could tell that there was a luggage tag on a particular piece of debris. We could see things like handles on the luggage. We did see things as small as silverware that was part of the meal service. We found different types of serving trays, windows.
The pictures were remarkable, but they had to be tied into the recovery efforts. They had to locate and describe targets for the divers who were working in the dark.
We were able to locate any particular target that we saw on the seafloor accurate to somewhere in the order of 3 to 4 meters. So we would then generate an image of the target with a latitude and longitude, give that to the divers for their operations the next morning, and then using their own differential GPS, they were able to go precisely to the location, drop down on the site, and in the matter of moments, locate the target and hook it up and recover it back to the surface.
The global positioning system was reaching from 22,000 miles up in space to under the Atlantic to help the divers.
Our biggest challenge is the area, the enormity of the area that this wreckage is spread over. We're working with a 3-mile by 6-mile area. We're talking about a depth of 120 feet, so we're talking about a bottom time of 13 to 18 minutes. And that does not allow us to put divers in and cover a large area. So we have to have an identifiable target before we put the divers down.
And once the divers got on target, their job was described as swimming in razor blades.
Walking on the bottom is real hazardous. Some of the pieces are pretty big, 5 or 6 feet tall. They're sharp, they're all over the place. You're walking with an umbilical trailing behind you, it gets snagged on everything.
Within a week, there was real progress. The divers had brought up half the bodies and large pieces of the plane in round-the-clock shifts. The men and women were pushing the limits of diving wisdom. They had to spend long recovery periods in decompression chambers in order to maximize their bottom time. Finally, the black boxes were found. They were rushed to Washington for downloading.
Excuse us.
At long last, Flight 800 would be required to give up its secrets.
And Copper State 162 appears you're overtaking the 727.
All right, what we have here is a visual indication of the audio information. The tapes are normally come in on a audio tape, and we'll digitize it, we'll save it on disk, and then we'll be able to display it in a waveform type format to be able to look at different frequencies to do analysis that way.
And in right base, runway 25. Yes, I've actually slowed down quite a bit this time. I can keep the flight on that behind him.
I mean, if this happened to be his last transmission before an incident or an accident, and there's a buzz or a whistle in the background that they might want to identify, whether it be a stall warning horn or something like that, we'd be able to pick out the frequency on here.
All recovered data end abruptly with no anomalies. The recording ends with a loud, unknown noise. This noise is heard on all of the 4 CBR channels. The flight appeared routine during ground operations, takeoff, and climb out.
The biggest surprise is anytime you lose an airplane so quickly. Normally in an accident, an airplane is crippled, it flies for some time, it attempts a landing or something of this nature, but you have some time and you capture some data on the recorders to try to better understand exactly what was going wrong with the airplane and what the problems were. In this case, we have none of that.
The disappointment was tangible. The flight data recorder showed the plane's systems functioning normally until a point where the power system went off, then nothing. The cockpit voice recorder showed the crew in the midst of a calm flight up to the same point, then it too cut off, with only a fraction of a second noise to tantalize investigators. In a few weeks, the investigators had nearly a third of the aircraft, and the rest was coming up fast.
That's a big wing that came in. And I asked the captain of the Grasp what the wing weighed, and they were estimating 20,000 pounds. That's a big piece of airplane out there.
It would now be necessary to reconstruct Flight 800, stitching it back together to see how and why it came apart.
A database for a 747 that completely disintegrated in midair and plunged to the ground is extremely small, this being one of them. Investigators are in the position of seeing things that they've never seen before.
But no matter, the investigators were totally confident.
I think within the next 48 hours we'll get something that we think is going to give us the clues that we need.
So Flight 800 wound its way through the Hampton summer to an old Grumman hangar in the town of Calverton. There, the ultimate step would be taken, and the pieces would be put back together from the nose wheel to the tip of the tail. And with the cause or perpetrators still untouched, it couldn't be too soon. Unscheduled hurricanes drove the searchers back to shore 4 times in the first 6 weeks after the crash. The heavy seas made life difficult both above and below the waterline.
All those tiny little bits of evidence and debris are under 120 feet of water, floating around among sand and silt that has now been stirred up by divers moving around, searching and retrieving bodies and larger pieces of wreckage, and by 3 hurricanes.
1 month after the crash, 206 bodies had been recovered and half the airplane. But the overall need was to find out what had gone wrong and make sure it did not happen again. Even at Boeing headquarters in Seattle, Flight 800 had them stumped.
We try to compare a lot of what we've seen here to previous incidences of airplanes that, we have lost. The Air India, Lockerbie, and there's been some others like that.
Steve Hatch is the man whose phone rings in the middle of the night when a 747 goes down.
We've looked at a lot of different scenarios that from previous accidents of airplanes, of things such as engine separations and thrust reverser events and Section 41 problems, and none of those lead to this type of incident that we had. And we do not understand it. We keep trying to look at the data, the reconstruction of the parts as they come into the hangar.
The hangar is an old Grumman hangar on Long Island. Steve Hatch was one of those who'd watched it fill up with the shattered fragments of Flight 800. As each piece came up, it was given a once-over on the boat. Intact, N93119 was a flying office building, 2/3 the length of a football field. Its fuselage, 15,000 square feet of aluminum, covered 100 miles of cable and thousands of parts. Once at the hangar, each piece gets a more serious scrutiny by the bomb techs from NTSB and the FBI. Only then does it go out on the hangar floor to become the latest piece in the massive jigsaw puzzle N93119 had become. Working the puzzle is an odd mixture of the investigators and some of their potential suspects. Reconstruction of an airplane is a last resort, expensive and time-consuming. It is undertaken only when all other means of solving a crash have failed. The most famous reconstruction was that of Pan Am 103, which crashed at Lockerbie, Scotland in 1988. Investigators were able to match a hole in the plane's skin to a damaged luggage container. Then they could see how a bomb had peeled away enough fuselage to rip the nose loose from the rest of the 747. At the hangar on Long Island, they have laid out a grid pattern on the floor to represent the dimensions of the airplane. The challenge is to fit every single piece of wreckage onto its proper place on the grid.
This is a piece, I would believe, from a body frame. When you first look at it, you try to decide if it's sheet material or plate. It could be a forging. It could be a casting. It could be made out of aluminum or titanium or stainless. It may be primered, as this one is. It may be painted. So it all has, it adds up to a kind of a personality that the part has, although you can't place this exactly on the airplane because many parts look very similar, but they're subtly different. So the REDARS system can help us. REDARS stands for Reference Engineering Drawing Automated Retrieval System. And what it will do for you is you can put in a part number or an assembly or an installation level number, and the drawing will come out of the PC. This is a side view of the airplane, or in terms of the airplane in general, it's a section of the frame just below door number 1, right in here. So what we would do is take this part, knowing where it would go, and we would go out into the reconstruction area, and we'd place that part down, and then we'd repeat that process many, many times.
The plane itself talks to the investigators in several ways. What do the pieces of metal show, and not only metal, other debris, seats, luggage, and even the bodies? What do they show as far as trace evidence of elements which should not be there?
Any such conversations between N93119 and its investigators will have to take place in the hangar, where the 747 parts are laid out and mocked up. The center fuel tank and fuselage in this area, seats and cabin interior in a separate building. The hope is to show where the pieces were and what they were doing at the instant Flight 800 blew up.
When you put things in relationship to each other and you look at which way certain things are deforming and breaking and so forth, it tells a story.
All theories lead to the center fuel tank, or wing box, a part of the frame that supports the wings and can carry fuel on longer flights. On TWA800, it held only a few gallons, but most everyone agrees something or someone set off the vapors inside it.
I think it's fair to say that in that area of the central fuel tank, that there is evidence that there was an explosion.
The airplane immediately came apart. A section of the airplane of approximately 21 feet comes right out of the forward section of it, forward of the wing front spar. And it takes an enormous amount of energy to do something like that.
So it was back to the drawing board, literally, to look for a cause.
We had some skin panels that came off early. The rest of the airplane followed. There's nothing fantastically different or sensational about this. It's just that initiating cause that we're still not able to put our finger on. We've got our eyes wide open and we're looking for anything that this plane would like to tell us, but it hasn't done so far.
From 10-ton wing segments, the investigation had moved to the microscopic in just a few weeks.
This is not a fracture, so to speak. It is a documentation of a light bulb to see if it had been on or not, if it was illuminated at the time of the crash, for instance. A lot of these indicator bulbs will indicate whether you had a system problem. They're warning lights that are on airplanes. So a lot of times we will get involved in looking at these lights to see if they're on or off. Most of the time we can't tell if they're off, but we can tell if they're on. This is a tungsten filament. Basically, you're looking at, you can see these crystalline surfaces that have occurred on it. And you can also maneuver the sample around. You can rotate the sample, you can move it up and down. You can see the coil coming up here. This was a very small, probably a very, very small filament. And right at the end of this, you see this ball. And that is indicative of something that's melted off the end of that filament. And it's indicative of the thing being burned out or being hot at the time that it had broken.
The investigation had settled into a routine. The briefings became notable for their lack of information, until the New York Times revealed what looked like a breakthrough. Traces of PETN and RDX had been found on Flight 800. They are prime components of Semtex, a plastic explosive made in Czechoslovakia and a favorite of terrorists in their long line of airplane bombings, which began with empty planes in the desert and devolved to the destruction of a full plane in the sky over Lockerbie. A bomb was starting to look like the best answer.
As a result of scientific analysis conducted by federal examiners, microscopic explosive traces of unknown origin have been found relating to TWA Flight 800.
At this level of investigation, there is no such thing as a simple explosion. They are low order or high order, hard or soft. A fuel tank explosion is considered in relative terms gentle. A bomb is hard. Each leaves its own distinctive pattern.
You would probably be looking for evidence of what they call micro-cratering, which is basically very small, hot particles that impinge onto the surface. They produce kind of like a volcanic movement of the material. And this signifies that you have a high energy but very small particle that's impinging onto the surface. You also look for various types of things such as gas washing, where you had hot gases that go up against the surface.
But for every theory, there was a counter theory.
Now, as a person who works with explosives, I certainly know that there can be an explosive contamination without that being direct evidence of a bomb. Recently, I found out my purse was contaminated with explosives, and I don't carry bombs in my purse.
Jimmy Oxley sets off bomb detectors in airports. Not surprising, since she studies explosives at the University of Rhode Island.
There.
When investigators on Flight 800 had trouble developing leads, Dr. Oxley did some saltwater tests to satisfy her own curiosity.
We were wondering how long in seawater the residue would last. We made a mixture of the RDX and PETN dissolved it up, and put it on some aluminum rods. And we found after 3 weeks there was none remaining.
The traces of explosives did not bring any closure to the investigation. In fact, they added to the confusion and the never-ending progression through the three theories. What was once a race to name the cause and the culprits had become a test of endurance. From the very first moments of the crash of Flight 800, there has been no shortage of theories as to what happened.
Hey, someone shot off a flare.
Friendly fire.
Detonation of a bomb.
Pan Am 103 underwater.
A shooting star.
The RDX and PETN.
Oh my God.
Something or someone had blown a magnificent piece of machinery into small pieces, killing 230 people, and had then stolen away without leaving a trace. It was an affront to the best minds in law enforcement and forensic detection. The missile theory was the first up on its feet, thanks to a lot of people who believed they saw something.
I'd have to say I think something was shot from the ground.
The idea that a combat missile could get into the wrong hands was a national horror.
The missiles that are readily available on the black market are marginally capable of destroying a commercial airliner like the 747. They're designed primarily to strike the engines, and on a four-engine aircraft, the odds that you're going to hit an engine and destroy the airplane and bring everybody to their death are slim.
But even if a missile had been fired at Flight 800, there was no explanation for how someone could do that and get clean away. On the night of July 17, US Air and Alitalia airliners were both in the vicinity of Flight 800. Air National Guard units were in the air too, with a helicopter and a C-130 transport practicing for a space shuttle launch. It is also believed the Navy had a P-3 submarine tracking aircraft and a guided missile cruiser in the area on some kind of exercise. And the Navy watches the whole East Coast with its giant killer radar near Norfolk, Virginia. Plus, there are enough spy satellites up there that it's reasonable to assume someone would have noticed a missile close in on Flight 800 and phoned it in. And what about all those people along the shore who claimed to see something approach Flight 800 on the night of the crash? There was even a friendly fire theory that somehow a U.S. missile had gotten loose by accident and found Flight 800 as it climbed out over the Atlantic.
I'm one of the few people around that has had missiles fired at him, right? And the missiles that I have had fired at me didn't look like this. No.
Still, the missile theory has stayed on the board, the lack of evidence offset by eyewitnesses and the horrible implications.
A determination that this plane was brought down by a missile would basically be an admission to the flying public all over the world that there's no defense for you if you're traveling on a commercial airliner.
As the missile theory lost altitude, investigators turned to the idea of a bomb.
I've done 33 explosions on aircraft of all different types except the 747.
During 20 years as chief bomb sleuth for the FAA, including work on Lockerbie, Walter Korsgaard liked to brag he'd blown up more planes than any terrorist. He has definite thoughts on what brought down Flight 800.
It looks like Pan Am 103 underwater.
At the hangar, investigators had found signs of a gentle or soft type of explosion that moved outward from the center fuel tank.
And that's very believable from the way that the metal has been pushed out of the center fuel tank. But we don't know if that's, at this point, we don't know if that's the cause or a result of what happened.
But investigators were still looking for traces of a sharp, fast explosion, indicating a bomb or shaped directional charge of plastic explosives.
When we're talking PETN or RDX, we're talking 8,000 meters per second is the motion. It's faster than I can snap my finger that this change from the solid to the gas is occurring.
And that incredible speed leaves its own footprint.
Very rough, sharp edges instead of nice, clean tears. They're going to be looking for pitting, such as you see on this piece, which is made by the gas jets, the hot gas jets coming off the explosion.
But so far, the bomb theory is scraps and circumstantial evidence. There were radar hits showing small pieces of the plane's skin falling away first, often signs of a bomb. The black boxes went down immediately and left only a loud, brief noise. This indicates a sudden cataclysmic event rather than a gradual breakdown. There are signs of shock waves and distortion around the fuselage of Flight 800, consistent with a bomb blast. There were signs of PETN and RDX in the plane and fist-sized holes in seats above the center fuel tank. These could be signs of a bomb, and some of the missing bodies appear to be from the same section.
There are definite indications of bomb-like damage on the debris that they're bringing out from TWA800, and there are definite indications of structural failure on the aircraft. And that's why the investigators are puzzled.
The traces of explosives might be explained by training sessions for bomb-sniffing dogs a few weeks before the crash, and are not large enough to prove the bomb theory on their own.
Shortly after Pan Am's 747 was blown up over Lockerbie, I spoke with a high Pan Am official who basically said, boy, we hope it's a bomb. Because if it's not a bomb, we face major problems and the industry faces major problems. That's the same case in this crash.
The older generations of jetliners are called classics or geriatrics, depending on whether you're buying one or selling one.
Older jets don't, it's not a matter of them really wearing out. They have virtually an unlimited lifespan. It's a matter of proper maintenance and staying, keeping up with the airplane.
At Boeing and TWA, they sell performance and reliability. In doing so, they've become two of the great brand names in the world. But mechanical failures are a fact of life in aviation, and we have all been living with the uncertainties of air travel for most of the century. Sometimes what goes up comes back down fast and well ahead of schedule.
I think it's important to remember that the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded. The probability of that failure was extremely low, but yet if all conditions were right, it was predicted that such a failure could occur.
While the 747 is designed for at least 20,000 cycles or flights, there is lots of wear and tear along the way, and the problem could brew for years.
What people don't understand is when we talk about 14,000 cycles or 16,000 cycles, each one of them is like a balloon which blows up a little as it goes up in the air and then comes back together when it comes down to normal pressure area. And it does that again and again. And this is metal, it's not rubber. And it has built into it a certain amount of flexibility, but fatigue will set in.
The center fuel tank on a Philippine Airlines Boeing 737 exploded on the runway in Manila 6 years ago. No cause was ever nailed down, although the electrical system was strongly suspected. Investigators have looked in particular for how an electrical spark from a fuel pump or probe may have set off the center fuel tank on Flight 800. But Boeing's design for its center tank structure has stood up to emergency landings and everything else for decades.
You design the whole fuel system to reduce or eliminate the hazards of carrying a flammable substance. All sorts of shielding, venting, so that your vapor buildup is under control. What wiring, very little wiring that's in the tanks is extremely low voltage, designed it won't generate a spark that's hot enough to ignite a fuel vapor.
It seems unlikely that a small spark within that tank could cause a fuel-air explosion of the vapors in that tank of the magnitude necessary to tear that airplane apart.
Enough 747s get up and down every day to make it a hard sell that the plane just self-destructed. And so far, Boeing is adamant that their plane and its systems worked.
We have looked at all the airplane systems and have the confidence that, hey, it was not an airplane mechanical malfunction that initiated the event. But we'll have to continue to look at the data and work on these things until the evidence is found from some other faction.
TWA and their insurers and their lawyers and the FAA is not going to concede that a bomb brought this airplane down unless there's clear and compelling evidence that that's the case. And Boeing is not going to concede that a structural failure brought this plane down unless, again, there's clear and compelling evidence to support that.
But with less and less of the plane to be recovered, the chance of finding the compelling evidence seemed to be slipping away. With most of Flight 800 present and accounted for, it's just slivers left to look at and study. What they call the Eureka piece, the fragment that will get them to stand up and scream, "I've found it," is still missing.
We may be looking for things that are only a few square inches that we'd like to see, and amidst 175 tons of airplane, you may not see it right away.
Success that once looked inevitable now seems like a long shot. But before Flight 800 joins the 5 other U.S. air crashes designated cause unknown, there is work to do. Investigators are dredging the debris fields to find the last few fragments of Flight 800. The Navy has fine-tuned its sonar towfish. It'll use low-frequency sonar beams to look half a foot under the sandy bottom.
It's not a very high-resolution system, but it will give us, we hope, some indication of larger pieces of wreckage, perhaps, that have, in fact, settled into the 8 to 10 inches of silt that we have on the bottom.
Special metal detectors are being brought in. They are so sensitive they can find the tip of a ballpoint pen. But there are no guarantees.
We're also, all of us, I mean the American public, we're used to technology providing good, quick answers. It doesn't really happen sometimes in accident investigation. We all have to be very patient and not give in to speculation.
After Lockerbie, there was a call for better inspection of airline baggage and cargo. Finally, some of those new machines are showing up. They don't just spot a pistol, they can smell plastic explosives. And people are developing a bomb-resistant luggage container. The bag might still blow up, but the force of the explosion is directed away from the airplane's skin. Investigators on Flight 800 have expressed interest in blowing up the fuel tank on a retired 747 to see if it gives them any new ideas. Some of the investigators have even discussed firing off a missile to compare a real launch with the accounts of the eyewitnesses, whatever it might take.
We're not going to back away ever until we come to a conclusion of what happened here.
Although Lockerbie was known to be a bomb within a few days, the breakthrough in the investigation came after a full 2 years of hard slogging. The critical clue was the size of a small fingernail.
The folks that create most of the time pressures are the media, not the American people. I think most people understand that things take time.
For some of the investigators, like Ed Sadi, who ran the laser line scan, Flight 800 is impossible to leave behind.
Once I got on the aircraft to fly home, you couldn't turn it off. You were looking at pieces of cloth, pieces of seats, pieces of the overhead storage cabinets, looking outside at the wings. Everything that we saw on the laser suddenly became an image on the piece of the aircraft.
At the Grumman hangar on Long Island, the wreckage may not have told investigators what they need to hear, but it has not remained mute.
The first time out there, I remember walking through the parts of the airplane and having this strange sensation that the people that were on board the flight were actually watching us there in the hangar and what we were doing, and you know, wanting us to find out what went wrong and would cause this thing to happen.
How Flight 800 came apart and why could be a mystery for a long time, but no one is ready to stop looking for the cause. And most of the investigators agree they know where the answer will be found. It will be in the last place they look.